The Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the two great foundational works of Western literature. They're both written by Homer, according to tradition. The Iliad is a story of war. The Odyssey is a story of home. It's also a story of adventure. The Odyssey isn't just one of the foundational works of Western literature, it's also the template for so many of the adventure stories that we tell. Most adventure stories use part, if not all, of these elements. And so that makes it worthy of studying anyway. And if you pay attention to how the old classics of literature are constructed, I find that it makes you appreciate modern stories even more because you can kind of see the elements. For instance, you have to have a worthy hero. So the stories focus on a particular person and some sort of force that is opposed to him. There's some sort of force or being opposed to him. We might think of a villain. In our case with the classic myth stories, then it's often a god. So Poseidon is kind of our villain god here who has something against Odysseus. There's chaos at home that must be set right. So there's this pressing need at home, and the hero has to go there and to fix things. And then there are lots of strange experiences along the way. Many adventures, things like that. Monsters and villains and different creatures he encounters and has to overcome. And then finally, there is a triumphant return. Now, one of the interesting things also is this concept of in medias res, which means in the middle of things. Not all stories do this, but so many of them still do that it's worth noting and worth talking about. In medias res means that it begins in the middle of things. This isn't an origin story. We don't start with Odysseus as a young child. We start in the middle of the story. He has been trying to go back to Ithaca, to his home after the war, but he can't get there. He's been wandering for 10 years, of course. So this starts at a particular point, and then it goes back and gives you a recap. And then you go through flashbacks to a recap, and then you go forward to the ending, which, I recently saw Deadpool, and that's exactly how Deadpool works, where it starts in the middle of an adventure, and then he goes back and explains and catches you up, and then he takes you to the end. So we see that the structure is still used heavily today, and it comes from, Homer, from the Odyssey. The story centers on the person of Odysseus and his travel home after the Trojan War. He spent 10 years at war, and he's going to spend 10 years at sea trying to get home. Now, Odysseus himself is your archetypal Greek. He is clever and very, very smart, and is very, very difficult to trick. And usually he has some sort of trick in mind. That's not to say that he is weak, though, because he's not just a trickster. He's also really powerful and a great warrior. And because of that, like so many Greeks of his era, adventurous. That life of piracy calls to them, and they love to make their living by adventure on the sea. You can't keep him out of adventures, and he's always looking for new things to experience. And he has this insatiable curiosity, this desire to experience everything and to know everything. And this will cause some of the problems that he experiences and lead to a number of disasters for his men. And you can see here in this map some of the possible routes that he took. This is mythology. A lot of these lands are made up. Nobody really knows, so a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time trying to figure out maybe he went here, maybe he went there, because Homer did use actual places sometimes in his writings, and that's obviously one of the ways that Troy was discovered. But mostly I put it up there just so you can see that his wandering went here and there and in all sorts of different places before he finally made it home. The first 4 books of the Odyssey actually set the stage, and these are called the Telemachy because the main character here is Telemachus. That's the son of Odysseus, and it lays out the problem. He's been gone for 20 years. That's 10 years in war and 10 years wandering around, and he's left behind his wife, Penelope. Now, you have to imagine she was quite young when he left, and it's doubtful they knew each other all that well, but they did have a child. And now the child is coming of age. Unfortunately, he's not old enough to take the kingdom yet. And the problem is that Penelope, still young enough to be a wife and quite beautiful, of course, as all of these women in mythic stories are, and she has a massive kingdom here. Odysseus isn't around to protect her or to protect the kingdom or his family. And so that has drawn a lot of local nobles. And so there are suitors. There are over 100 men who are courting her, who want to marry her and become heirs to the kingdom. And her job is to keep them from doing this, keep them at odds with one another. And we see that Penelope is really this great heroine of the mind. She doesn't use her sexuality like Helen, and she isn't a violent, heroic type like Clytemnestra. She doesn't just slaughter people. She uses her brain, and she outwits these men for an entire decade really. She keeps them at bay, waiting for the day when Odysseus will come home. But Telemachus is coming of age now, and since he is coming into his manhood, the suitors are plotting to kill him. And they think that if they kill him, then they can finally take the kingdom. So he sets out and search for Odysseus, and it's in this search then that he runs into Nestor and Menelaus and Helen, and we see those stories. So where is Odysseus? Well, for the past 7 years, he's been stuck on an island of Ogygia with the goddess Calypso. Now, Calypso is madly in love with Odysseus, and she wants him to stay there and be immortal and live forever and ever and keep his youth, which not all the mortals who get involved with goddesses get to do that. But she's fixed everything, but he can't do it. He can't take his mind away from home, from hearth, from Penelope and his child. And so his life is like this. Every day he sits on the beach looking toward home and crying and thinking about the miserable fate that he's experienced. And every night he spends the night making love with the dread goddess Calypso. And every day he gets up again and mourns the loss of his home and cries and mopes and sulks. And every night he spends the night making love with Calypso. And so it's a very strange life that he leads here. The gods finally take pity on him, and Athena convinces Zeus to send Hermes down to have a talk with her, and so they can send him home. And she finally agrees to let him go home. And when he sails away, well, he runs into Poseidon. Poseidon is not going to have this, and he wrecks the boat, and so he winds up shipwrecked on the island of the Phaeacians, and this is where the flashback begins. His adventures include a lot of monsters and very strange things, and we'll hit a few of the highlights here. Of course, the land of the Lotus Eaters is one of the big ones. He says, they sent some of my followers inland to find out what sort of human beings might be there. And we'll see this as a theme with Odysseus. Whenever he goes to a new place, he never just goes and resupplies. He wants to find out what's there. It's always the curiosity, the quest for the unknown, the desire to experience and to understand and to learn the minds of many men, as the text actually says. What he finds here are these flowers that keep you asleep all the time, and so everyone just falls asleep, and they have to find a way back onto the ship. Of course, Odysseus drags them all back onto the ship, though everyone wants to stay. Now, we see a lot of these stories and we say, aha, narcotics, obviously this is heroin or something. Well, maybe, who knows. But anyway, it's the story of the Lotus Eaters and this first great adventure where they have to overcome the desire to sleep eternally. The most famous of all the stories is probably the story of Odysseus facing Polyphemus the Cyclops. We see a lot of descriptions here that give us some insight into how the Greeks viewed the world and how they looked at civilization. The description of the Cyclops is that they are a fierce, lawless people who never lift a hand to plant or plow, but just leave everything to the immortal gods. And so we see first here, then, the statement that those who aren't involved in farming, in the production of food, then, aren't even really part of civilization. It's very strange to the Greeks because this is the first and most important business of a civilized people, and that is to produce food, not to hunt and to gather, but to actually create it, to work the land itself. And the Cyclops, by standing outside of that, place themselves outside of civilization itself. After the production of food, the most important thing is to live by the rules of the assembly, to have laws, to have order, to have justice, to actually have a system where humans work together in cooperation. The Cyclops, though, we're told, have no assemblies for the making of laws, nor any established legal codes, but live in hollow caverns in the mountain heights, where each man is the lawgiver to his own children and women, and nobody has the slightest interest in what his neighbors decide. So again, we see the Cyclops not only reject the production of food, but they reject the very notion of community. And again, we see them as these archetypes for the anti-civilized forces, the forces of uncivilization or non-civilization. They are against civilization, which makes them really un-Greek. And we have this great distinction between the home that Odysseus has idealized, what he has in mind, community, and the things that he sees along the way, which are the rejection of community and the rejection of society and the rejection of civilization. We also see that Odysseus has maybe an uncomfortable relationship with civilization. He wants to experience things. He's fascinated by the things that are different. So we see here, for the time being, stay here while I go in my ship with my crew to find out what kind of men are over there, and whether they are aggressive savages with no sense of right or wrong, or hospitable and God-fearing people. Well, anytime you say that, you're looking for trouble, right? Because if they are aggressive savages with no sense of right or wrong, why do you want to go find them? Because he's Odysseus. And Odysseus wants to know, he wants to see, he wants to understand those things that are out there that are different. Now his men beg him so often, please, can we just avoid this adventure? If they're unhospitable, let's leave them alone. But Odysseus says, no, I must understand, I must see. So most of you stay here, but I'll go with just a few, and we'll sort out and see what sort of men these are. Of course, he runs into the giant Cyclops Polyphemus, who is uncivilized, and who is a brute, and who does not live by law. Odysseus, though, being clever, never quite uses his own name. Whenever he gets trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, and the question comes up, who are you? Well, he gives the name, my name is Utis, which means nobody, and this comes into play a little bit later. Odysseus asks for a guest gift. And since we've talked about guest gifts, we know the importance of this. We know the importance of hospitality. One more way that Polyphemus rejects civilization is that he rejects the basic law of hospitality, which puts him, or should put him, at odds with the gods, with Zeus anyway. But he's a child of Poseidon, and he does not fear the gods, because he's not that far removed from the gods themselves. So what does he give as his guest gift when Odysseus demands one? Well, he eats some of Odysseus's men, and the image is quite descriptive. It says he dashes their heads together like you kill puppies, which is strange because apparently they kill puppies by dashing their brains. But he does this, and he eats the men, and he offers as his gift that he will eat Odysseus last. Well, Odysseus has to figure out what to do. And so this is really one of the ways we can see his cleverness. Because here's the problem. They're trapped in the cave, and if they kill him, well, they can't get out of the cave because there's a giant boulder blocking the door. So they have to find a way to incapacitate him and get him to remove the boulder. So they decide to get him drunk. They brought in a whole lot of wine, and they get him really drunk. And then they blind him with this giant stick they've hardened in the fire. Again, it's quite descriptive in the Greek, and he's throwing up. I always like the description. He's spewing forth fleshy man chunks, so it's just really descriptive and disgusting. But he does this. And he throws up because he's not used to drinking, and he's been blind, and he's in pain, and then he starts reaching for them. But he has all these flocks in there, all these sheep, and so they hide under them. And he tries to separate them from the sheep by opening up the cave and letting the sheep go out. And when they go out, the men go with them and they escape. And they almost get away without any further problems. But Odysseus can't help himself, and he yells back, "You want to know who it is? It's not nobody. It's Odysseus, sacker of cities. I'm the one who did this." And so now he finally has someone to place his rage on. Because he had been running around telling everybody, "Look, everybody, nobody blinded me, nobody blinded me." And it's kind of funny, and kind of sad, but kind of funny. And everyone says, "Ah, you're just being crazy." But now that he has the name, he prays to his father Poseidon, a very specific curse. And we see these curses always seem to work. And so Odysseus then sails away, but he sails away with the curse and the animosity of Poseidon. And this shows Odysseus' own hubris, because he had escaped, but he just has to rub it in. He wants people to know that he's the one who did this. And by exhibiting this bit of hubris, then, he seals the doom of most of his men. and he makes his own return much more difficult than it already was. The curse is taking terrible effect, and Odysseus loses his entire fleet except one ship. He finds himself on the island of Circe, who is another goddess/sorceress. Now he sends people up there to find out what's going on with her, although nobody really wants to find any more adventures at this point. But he sends them, and what they find is a nice, hospitable woman who gives them all drinks. Of course, after they drink, they are turned into pigs. They turn into pigs, and then they have to stay in her pen, and she has all of these sailors and all of these men who are just turned into animals on her farm. One man escapes, comes down and tells Odysseus, they've been turned into animals, we have to leave. Odysseus, though, well, now he wants to see this for himself. Maybe get his men back, but I think really he wants to see this. And along the way, while he's going up to visit Circe, Hermes appears and tells him about Circe and how to overcome her power. And so, of course, he does, and you read that in the chapter that we were reading for today. And it's a really interesting story, I think, because he overcomes her power, and then he takes her as a lover also. And they actually spend a year there with him as her bedmate, and I don't know if she ever actually has a whole lot of affection for him. He's just kind of there, and there's not a lot she can do about it. But he stays as the bedmate, and finally the men say, Odysseus, can we leave, please? It's time to leave. And he says, yes, I guess you're right. We need to reconsider home. And so then she gives them advice on how to proceed and how they can best make their way home. Circe sends him to the underworld to find Tiresias. Tiresias, you might recall, the blind seer of Thebes. And Tiresias will be the one who will advise him on how to make it home. While he's down there, of course, being Odysseus, he doesn't just want the information. He actually wants to talk to everyone he can. And so we see not only this first great description of the underworld in Greek literature, but we also see more development of the character of Odysseus. He gets the information, and then he talks to everybody he can. All the heroes from Troy, heroes from the past. He finds Agamemnon, and this is an interesting meeting because Agamemnon, of course, is dead. And what Odysseus hears is that he got home and his wife was waiting with a new man and killed him. So now Odysseus has this anxiety. What about Penelope? What is waiting for him when he's at home? And this is something that is overhanging the plot. We're wondering what actually is going to happen when he gets home, and that's always in the back of his mind. What's he going to find when he gets there? Is she waiting for him? Are the men going to kill him? Is there still a kingdom? And he doesn't know. And so that will color events as we proceed, and you see it makes him react in certain ways when he finally does get home. And then he finds his mother, Anticlea. And so all in all, it's an interesting and successful trip, and then he makes his way back to the outer world. One thing he found in the underworld is that he's going to have to face a number of monsters on the way home. One group he'll have to face are the sirens, and the sirens have these heavenly voices that lure sailors onto rocks to their doom, and then they eat the sailors. If you hear their music, you cannot resist them. And so the trick, he was told, is to stuff your ears with wax and sail past them so you won't hear them. Odysseus, though, being Odysseus, isn't content to just sail by and never experience their song. And so he has his men tie him to the mast, as you can see in the picture there, and then stuff their ears with wax. Now, they sail past, but he gets to hear the song of the sirens. And the song of the sirens drives him mad with desire, and he just wants more than anything to go and to hear them. But since he's bound, he can't. The men make it past them, and then his madness dies. And then he becomes the only man who ever hears the song of the sirens and lives. He's also told that he has to choose between either going through what are called the planctai, the crashing cliffs, these cliffs that crash together and smash everything in between them, or Scylla and Charybdis. You remember we already talked about Scylla and Charybdis in an earlier lecture. Well, Scylla, of course, the giant monster with the dog head monsters coming out of her stomach that eat sailors as they pass by, or Charybdis, the monster that swirls up the ocean and spits it out. It's kind of like a whirlpool. He's told to try to go in between, but if you have to veer one way or another, go towards Scylla, because Scylla will kill some of your men, but Charybdis will wreck everything. So, He does, and he's told not to fight Scylla because you can't actually fight Scylla. But of course, Odysseus, being Odysseus, puts on his armor and he wants to do combat with the undefeatable Scylla, and so he does. Well, Scylla eats some of his men, he gets away, but he does get to live through combat with Scylla, one more thing that he experiences that no other mortal can claim. After further adventures, he loses his ship and the rest of his crew. And then, of course, he finds his way to the island of Aegyptia with Calypso, which is where the story began. And then he sails off to the Phaeacians, and when he's there, they equip him, and they send him home. And finally, he makes it to Ithaca. But he doesn't just go in and announce himself and say, "I'm Odysseus, I'm here, I have returned," the way Agamemnon did. Not Odysseus, not with everything he's experienced and learned and everything that he knows. Instead, Odysseus returns in disguise. He wanders through the land and he tests the faithfulness of everyone, and he tries to find out who's on what side and what exactly has been going on. The one creature that recognizes him, it's a really touching story. When he shows up, his dog, Argos, sees him, and Argos hasn't seen him for 20 years, so you imagine how old he is if you know anything about dogs. He's been waiting all this time for the return of his master, and Argos, the faithful dog, sees Odysseus, and then he dies, content that he has seen his master one last time. Finally, he's made his assessment of the situation and is ready to act. He's content that Penelope is not involved with the suitors, but he still wants to make sure. Now, Penelope had arranged things so that she said she would finally marry someone when she had finished making Odysseus' funeral shroud, and every day she would sew, and every night she would tear up what she had made before. The men figured out this trick, and then she was forced into other means of keeping them at bay. And finally, she decided that the man who could string Odysseus' bow and fire an arrow through the holes in 12 axe heads in a row, that would be the man that she would marry. Odysseus, then, being Odysseus, is the only one who could do this. Now, there's a long story, and it's a really good story, and if you have the time, you really should go and read the entire Odyssey, because it is a fantastic work. All of these things are fantastic, but the Odyssey especially I like, and the ending is such a satisfying ending in many ways. He stands up, and they've been abusing him. He's pretending to be this old beggar, and so they've been very mean. But of course, then he stands up and he strings the bow, and everyone knows they're in trouble. He fires through the axe heads, and then he announces himself, "I am Odysseus, sacker of cities, and I have returned," and everyone falls into a panic. And then he kills all the suitors. He, his son Telemachus, and a couple of loyal servants, and they just slaughter them all. It's this mass slaughter. And then the servants who had helped them, they make the servants clean up all the blood and the gore and drag out the bodies, and then they execute them too. Since Odysseus has finished off all the suitors, and he's killed everybody who might possibly be waiting to kill him, and he's made sure that there's no Aegisthus hiding anywhere, and that he is perfectly safe at this point, now he announces himself to Penelope. It's interesting that he waited until that point, because he was not going to be taken unawares like Agamemnon. But he expects Penelope to run to his arms, and her heart leaps. She is happy, if it's truly him, and she's very happy that the suitors are all dead. However, she doesn't trust him yet, because as Odysseus is Odysseus the clever and Odysseus the wise, Penelope is a suited mate for him indeed, because she is Penelope the circumspect. That's what they call her. She's always looking around, making sure that everything is okay, and she's never trusting anyone. And so she sees him, and she maintains her distance, and she keeps cold distance from him. She doesn't believe it, because anyone could wander in. She hasn't seen him in 20 years. And remember, they were quite young when they were married, so it's not like she really remembers him all that well. So anyway, Odysseus is upset, but she has her own way of finding out who he is, and it centers on the bed. He suggests maybe he should sleep in another room if she's not going to take him in. And he says, well, why don't we move your bed outside of the house? And that's the trick, because his bed is apparently made from an olive tree itself. And so the idea that the olive tree bed could be moved outside is something that he thinks is ridiculous, and he gets very upset. He thinks she's done something to the bed, and then she knows, since he understands that the bed is made out of a tree, that he's the only one who's actually seen the bed, that it is in fact him, and then they can rush to each other's arms. And what is Odysseus' first thing to do? Well, as always, he wants to go straight to bed and straight to the lovemaking, and so they do. And it's kind of touching. Athena holds dawn back and keeps the night lasting as long as they possibly need. And so they do. They make love and they sit in their bed, and then they recount all of their stories and they tell everyone of everything that's happened, or they tell each other everything that's happened to them. Odysseus' story is interesting because he mentions the monsters, but when it comes to the women, he says things like, well, Calypso wanted to make me her husband, but I resisted, I refused. Which I guess makes sense, because that's not what I was going to tell her, that he was shacked up with a goddess for 7 years while she was sitting here fending off the suitors. Instead, he makes himself sound very innocent, but very heroic. Now, though, they have one more problem. Odysseus killed over 100 nobles in his own kingdom and the surrounding lands, and they all have families. Remember the code of vengeance and all the vengeance we've talked about. Well, he knows he has brought down a heap of vengeance upon himself, and he knows they have to come and get him. So he takes his family and they go to their country palace and they fortify it and they begin to get ready for the battle. And just as the families are approaching and you're going to have a massive battle, the likes of which he hasn't seen since Troy, Athena shows up. She intervenes, and we have the original Deus Ex Machina. The goddess appears and tells everyone that everything should be settled and everything should be right. And then the story just ends with peace reestablished in Ithaca. This ends the lecture. Next, we'll take up the topic of Perseus and the legends of Argos.